Peace, peace, peace. Welcome to another episode of Wise the Dome TV. Today, I have a very, very special guest. It's dealing with a topic that has piqued my interest for a while, a topic that I feel like is extremely important. But before we go there, uh, this brother here has written for many publications, from The Hill to New Republic, writer, editor, independence advocate. Um, Alberto Medina, thank you for coming through Wise the Dome TV.
Thank you so much, Rakeem. Really appreciate the invitation. Really happy to be here to talk about Puerto Rico.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I like to start from the beginning so people can kind of see the entire picture. Um, so when we discuss Puerto Rico and the history of Puerto Rico as a colony of America, obviously Christopher Columbus arrived in Puerto Rico in 1493, and the subsequent centuries after that was Spanish colonialism. Additionally, after actually the Spanish American War in 1898, right? And then the signing of the Treaty of Paris, and then the cession of Guam and Puerto Rico to the United States. If you can give us some of that history, from the beginning, and we'll continue on to modern times.
Sure, yeah, it's really important to have that historical context. Puerto Rico is often called the oldest colony in the world because, as you
Mm.
said, from 1493 on, we're talking 500 plus years. Puerto Rico has never been free. So, 400 years under Spain, and now going on 126 years under the United States. July 25th is actually the date of the invasion of Puerto Rico in 1898. So we're coming up on, the 126th anniversary of of Puerto Rico being a U.S. colony, specifically after many centuries under Spanish colonialism. A lot of people, I think, don't understand that history and don't understand the fact that Puerto Rico is a colony, in part because there's so many euphemisms that have been used historically to describe Puerto Rico's status. Oh, it's a territory, it's a commonwealth, but it's really a possession, as you said. It was taken as a price of war at the end of the Spanish-American War, as property, as a piece of territory that the United States wanted as part of its, imperialist expansionist project that, of course, included at the time also Cuba and the Philippines, which, were able to attain their independence, a little bit earlier, certainly than Puerto Rico has, since we haven't gotten there yet. And even though the relationship has changed in some ways, and we can talk about that a little bit more, the fundamental nature of Puerto Rico as a possession that is fully under the control of the United States, even if it does have a little bit of self-government and a little bit of local rule, that really hasn't changed. And the plenary power that Congress has over Puerto Rico, the Supreme Court decisions from 120 years ago that established the legal foundation of the United States being able to own Puerto Rico, those things are still legally and politically true to this day. So it's kind of the more things change, the more they stay the same situation.
Absolutely, absolutely. And just that, when you think about the idea of, you know, a nation and a nation of people being subjected and to being the spoils of war, right? Just that whole idea, and like, what do you think about just from this the idea from 1493 to now, uh, the people of Puerto Rico haven't been able to have any agency over the way they want to live and the way they want to have government and the way they want to do things, because it's always been an imperialist power, subjecting them to the imperialist rule.
Yeah, and that's something that's had such a profound impact on, the political development, or some would say the lack thereof, of political development in Puerto Rico. It's had profound impact on the Puerto Rican psyche, this idea that, of course, great academics and scholars like Frantz Fanon spoke about, colonialism is a state of mind too, right? It's not
Hmm.
just a political condition, and we see so many examples of that with Puerto Rico and with Puerto Ricans to this day. So it's something that, on the one hand, it is a grave, moral injustice, and you can think about it, from that ideological perspective that is really important. But it's also something that is just harming, Puerto
Mm,
Ricans every day, and has been for centuries now. Um, so, that's really the tragedy of what first Spain and now the United States has continued to do with Puerto Rico. And it's why it's such a profound injustice that I hope people start paying more attention to, and can do something about addressing.
absolutely, absolutely. In 1952, Puerto Rico attained Commonwealth status and became a Commonwealth of the United States. And as you mentioned, it's they like to throw these euphemisms out to, I guess, make it seem like something that it isn't. But what does being a Commonwealth to the United States actually mean, and what does it entail?
Yeah, so the history of this is really interesting because, we get to the late 1940s, early 1950s, it's post World War II. A lot of the empires of the world, right, are sort of collapsing, and there's this big movement for decolonization around the world, right? And
Mhm.
it's like, hey, Britain, you got to give up your colonies, and France, and this is just what's happening, and the UN is playing a role in that. And it turns out, hey, the United States has got some colonies too. What are we going to do about those? Because it's worth mentioning that while Puerto Rico is the largest and the most populous of America's colonies, it's one of five. You've got Guam, the U.S. Virgin Islands, um, American Samoa, and now I'm going to blank on the fifth one, but I'm going to remember it in a little bit.
No problem, no problem.
um, so, so here's what the United States does. It basically says, okay, we're gonna let Puerto Rico elect its own governor.
Mhm,
So from 1898 until 1948, Puerto Rico's governor was appointed by the United States president. And then they say, okay, and we're gonna let you write your own constitution. So Puerto Rico gets to write its own constitution. Um, Gets to write even already gets a little bit complicated because the Constitution is supposed to be the supreme law of the land of a nation. There is nothing above that. That is, the will of the people goes into that. Of course, if you think about the US Constitution with all its flaws, that's what it is, right?
mhm,
The Puerto Rican Constitution, Congress has to approve a law to even let us have one. Congress gets basically veto power
mhm,
over what gets to be in our Constitution. And they use it, by the way. So Puerto Rico put some rights in the Constitution that the U.S. didn't want us to have, so they made us take it out
mhm,
before they approved it. And
mhm,
they let us ratify it. But we get to elect our own governor. We get our Constitution. None of this changes the fact that Congress, as I just said, keeps having the ultimate power. Um, but then the United States goes to the UN, which, as we still see today, a lot of times does kind of what the United States
yeah.
wants it to do. And it says, well, look, Puerto Rico's not a colony anymore.
Mhm,
They elect their own governor. They got a constitution. We
mhm.
have a new sort of special relationship with them, right? It's called a Commonwealth. That doesn't really mean anything. I mean, Massachusetts is a Commonwealth.
Right, Virginia, right.
Right, right, right. What does that actually mean in terms of Puerto Rico? They just picked a word that they thought sounded good to try to
Mhm,
paper over the fact that Puerto Rico was essentially still a colony, which is something that they've had to acknowledge even in recent years in Supreme Court cases, that Puerto Rico has no sovereignty really, that Commonwealth status didn't really give it any sovereignty. But this is really what it means in terms of the nature of the relationship. Um, Congress continues to have power over Puerto Rico. It can write laws that apply to Puerto Rico, or if it writes a law and it doesn't want it to apply to Puerto Rico, then they decide that it doesn't, right? So it's up
right.
to their discretion. The U.S. president, which Puerto Ricans living on the island cannot vote for, signs those laws, or sends Puerto Ricans to war, right? If they sign up for the armed forces, Puerto Ricans, and again, when I say Puerto Ricans, that's obviously almost 6 million Puerto Ricans in the U.S., but I'm talking, the folks on the island. Um, Puerto Ricans have no voting representative in Congress. We have a rep called a resident commissioner, that cannot vote on the floor of the House of Representatives. So there's really, you know, uh, the worst of both worlds. We neither have full sovereignty as a nation, as a nation state, but then we don't have really any political power within the structures of the democratic systems of the United States. So Commonwealth, colony, whatever you want to call it, it is a system of political subordination.
Right. And this is somewhat rhetorical, but how does one justify not having a representative that can vote in Congress, not being able to vote for the president of the United States, but able to fight for the imperialist objectives of this country? I mean, it's just insane, you know?
Yeah, I mean that's a good question, and we should ask a lot of American leaders how they justify to themselves. Like I said, a lot of it is wrapped up in this idea of like, well, it's kind of a special treatment, right? So yeah, you don't have representation, but for example, people in Puerto Rico don't pay federal income tax. They do pay, federal Medicare taxes and Social Security taxes and all of that. To be able to participate in those programs. But since they don't pay federal income tax, then at least nobody can say like, well, it's taxation without
Yeah,
without
yeah.
representation, since that would be a bad look for a country that went to war on
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 those
those grounds.
principles, right?
Right, right. Which is always the funniest thing to me about, the United States denying, Puerto Rico its independence. Who loves independence more than the United States,
Right, right.
I was just at the Capitol building last week having some meetings, and you walk through the rotunda and you see all these statues and all these paintings to the heroes of independence, and it's like, damn, I'm here to try to talk about Puerto Rico's independence, and I had to
Yeah,
pass through the halls of the great, independence heroes of the United States. So yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of sort of little justifications and ways that people have argued that it's okay because of this or because of that, but you have it exactly right. There's really no moral or political justification for holding Puerto Ricans in that kind of political powerlessness.
absolutely, man. And one thing that I thought was extremely interesting in the article that you wrote, and I will, well, that you sent me, and I will post this in the description, but you stated that if Puerto Rico were to be considered a state of the United States, it would likely be the poorest state in the United States. And when we think about the Great Recession and then also the hurricane, which were both devastating for Puerto Rico, what is the connection between Puerto Rico's political status and the profound effects these disasters had on the island?
Yeah, that's a great question, especially because, after Hurricane Maria, especially in 2017, we do start to see some big changes in kind of the mindset of a lot of Puerto Ricans
Mm,
about the status, because, there was this idea of like, well, the relationship may not be perfect, but at least the US is there to protect us. The US is there to help us if we're ever in trouble. For example, if a Category 5 hurricane
hmm.
comes, we're going to be okay because the US is going to come to the rescue. And anybody who remembers, how that went, especially with with President Trump in charge, knows that didn't turn out to be the case. But to get back to the earlier part of your question, yeah, Puerto Rico is twice as poor as the poorest place in the United
Mm,
States in terms of poverty rate, in terms of median income, and a whole lot of other socioeconomic indicators. And it makes sense because there's never been a colony in the history of the world that is set up to be
right,
successful
right.
for the colonized people, that's set up to be, prosperous and for people to thrive. Colonies exist for the benefit of the colonizer. Colonies exist for exploitation. And in Puerto Rico anymore, in the 21st century, it's not going to look like the Belgian Congo. It's not going to look like, mining and people being whipped and a lot of these other things that people associate with colonialism. It's the 21st century. It's going to look like the tax code and subsidies for corporations and for billionaires to come into Puerto Rico. And
Hmm.
so it's important for people to think about too. This is sort of 21st century
Yeah,
colonialism that
yeah,
we're talking about. But Puerto Rico doesn't have the tools that a nation state would have for its economic development. It can't control its own currency and set monetary policy. It can't control its own trade.
mm,
Puerto Rico is strangled by laws like the Jones Act, which is a maritime trade law from the United States that basically says that goods that are coming into Puerto Rico have to be transported on a ship that was built and is crewed, by Americans.
wow.
So, you know, if we need some food or some gasoline or something, and maybe there's a ship from Costa Rica or from the Dominican Republic that we could get a cheaper deal on getting, we're an island. We need stuff
Yeah,
to come from outside.
yeah,
And to your point about the hurricane, Puerto Rico was without power almost the whole island for months
yeah.
after
I
after
remember.
Hurricane Maria.
Hmm.
People, including my own family, and I was living there at the time, we were relying on generators, right?
Mm,
Um, and there was literally a ship just waiting a couple miles off the coast of Puerto Rico, waiting for the president to approve an exemption or a waiver of this law so that that ship with critical fuel that was going to power, hospital generators, that was going to power, people's fridges so that they could keep their insulin,
hmm, hmm,
good. We had to wait for the president of the United States to say like, yeah, okay, I guess this ship can come in, and even if it's not an approved, American ship. Um, so all of this stuff, as I said, it has a real profound day-to-day impact on Puerto Ricans' lives, all the time. And when we're in desperate situations because of hurricanes or earthquakes or just because of the worldwide economic crisis, the U.S. isn't really looking out for
yeah.
Puerto Rico's best interests. So if there's a policy move that needs to be made, for example, people have been arguing for Puerto Rico to be exempted from the Jones Act or to get a waiver for decades,
Hmm.
and it hasn't happened because it's more important for the U.S. government to keep that money flowing to the maritime shipping industry, right?
Mm.
Because it's a subsidy for that industry, than to make life a little bit cheaper and a little bit more affordable for Puerto Ricans, which have some of the highest food prices and car prices in the world because of laws like this. So it has a real profound and deeply felt impact.
Can you talk a little bit more about that maritime industry and its relationship to Puerto Rico and also its relationship to the imperialists that get rich off of it?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's one really concrete example and something that's been studied a lot, and it's something that, by the way, doesn't just affect Puerto Rico. Hawaii also
Hmm.
faces a lot of these issues from the Jones Act. And it's obviously another island that needs to get a lot of its goods transported by ship.
Hmm.
But I think yeah, what's important to say about it is that is kind of the thing I'm talking about of 21st century colonialism, right? You're not going to have the kind of overt, violent domination anymore. What you're going to have is all these laws and policies and structures that are sometimes a little more hidden, a little bit more behind the scenes, but they just make, life a little harder or a little more unfair for people living in Puerto Rico for the benefit of, usually big companies and corporations, but sometimes wealthy individuals too. I mean, there's this whole other piece happening now with these laws that allow wealthy billionaires to move to Puerto Rico and pay almost no taxes. Some of that is local issues too, and local laws that have tried to do that for economic development. Because again, when you don't have the good tools of economic
Hmm.
development, you turn to bad tools, right?
Right. Hmm.
And you think that, oh, if you attract all these rich people, it's going to somehow trickle down, right? We
Hmm.
know how that argument goes. So the Jones Act is really one manifestation of that. It was
Mm.
like, okay, there's this law in the books, and it helps an industry in the United States. It makes things a little bit worse for Puerto Rico,
But
but
they'll be
they
all
don't.
right.
Yeah, they don't really have a choice, even if
Yeah.
they are or aren't all right, you know. Um, so it's one of the many ways in which throughout the decades, and again for more than a century now, the U.S. has just crafted these policies that benefit them at the expense of the Puerto Rican people, which again, I'm talking 40% poverty rate, which is twice as high as I think Mississippi's
Mm.
the poorest state in the
Mhm.
union, with about 20% poverty. The median income in Puerto Rico is about 25,000, 24,000. Again, that's about half of what it is in the poorest state in the US, where it's about 48, 49,000. Childhood poverty levels even worse than poverty overall. Um, so, when you think about a $24,000 median household income, and then food's a little more expensive, and the car that you need to get around, it's a little bit more expensive. This is really like hurting people every
Yeah.
day.
Right. 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 And so I've I've noticed for years, whenever Puerto Rico does come up, any type of, I guess, any type, whether if it's not dealing with like a tragedy like Hurricane Maria or anything like that, when it comes to the politics of Puerto Rico, I noticed that mainstream narratives often advocate for Puerto Rico's statehood as if this is the solution. And but you emphasize that statehood shouldn't be the goal. Um, Instead, full independence. And so I wanted to know if you could elaborate on why independence is a superior option to statehood. But because it's I remember it vividly, to be honest, where they would interview, different talking heads, like H. Rap Brown said, like they'll if you're a green man, they'll send a green man against you, right? And so and
Yeah, yeah,
and so they would have uh different people advocating for, Puerto Rican statehood, as if that was the end all be all, like the idea, hey, we just want to be a part of the United States, and we're down with everything the United States does and this and that. But I think obviously that was just the way that corporate media uh, tends to control the narrative and only let one voice be heard instead of real voices of dissent. But if you
yeah.
could elaborate on why independence is a superior option to statehood in this case.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And the first thing that's important to say is it's true that a lot of people in Puerto Rico want statehood, and
Mhm.
and historically that's been true. And the statehood party, Puerto Rico doesn't really have Democratic Republican Party. Some people affiliate with those, but the political parties in Puerto Rico are centered around, what people want Puerto Rico status to be. So there's a
Mhm.
pro-statehood party, a sort of pro-status quo party that's
Mhm.
thankfully kind of dwindling.
Yeah, yeah.
There's a pro-independence party that, one big part of this conversation is what the U.S. government with its local allies did to the Independence Party,
Mhm.
and to those activists for the better part of the 20th century. Um, but yeah, the statehood party's been in power. There are a lot of people who want statehood. I just think they're wrong.
Yeah, yeah.
I also think it's understandable when you think about, again, the impact of colonialism, the
Mhm.
impact of dependence.
Absolutely.
If all you've known is I need the United States to be there, I need to get that Social Security check, I need to
Mhm.
get those food stamps, right? And that's the really tragic part about a system of oppression and dependence, that the same people that are doing the oppressing throw you some crumbs, and
Yeah.
then you feel like you depend on the crumbs. So how could you ever think about leaving the oppressor, right?
Mhm.
So, one of the big arguments against statehood is that we need to get out of that state cycle, which statehood doesn't necessarily solve, because Puerto Rico's still going to be poor. Puerto Rico would still be a, state full of brown people, in a country that's like dealing with
Yeah.
with white supremacy,
Yeah.
not very successfully. And in Puerto
Mhm.
Rico, even as a state, would remain kind of the ugly
Mhm.
duckling in a way of the United States. um, but then it's also just wrong. I mean, the United States invaded a country,
Right.
invaded a nation, invaded a people, and has kept it colonized for 126 years.
Mhm.
So for those of us who believe in independence, we think that statehood wouldn't, end that colonialist project. It would be the ultimate victory of it, right? We
Right.
invaded this place and now we get to keep it
Right.
forever.
Right. Right.
You know,
Right. Right.
that's not that's not justice. Justice is, if you did this grave injustice of invading a people, let my people go.
Yep.
um, so from a moral, political
Mhm.
standpoint of justice, independence is the right way to go. From the standpoint again of what would it look like for Puerto Rico, the state of Spanish speaking, Latinos to join the United States, when I don't need to tell you, I don't need to tell anybody, what it's like to be a person of color, as people like to say now in this
Mhm.
in this country, right? And the challenges that come with that, and the discrimination and the continued oppression. Um, And there's this idea that like, oh, statehood means equality because
Right.
we got our two senators and we got our five representatives or however many it would be, and then Puerto Rico would automatically be equal with the rest of our quote unquote fellow Americans. And to my pro statehood compatriots who think like that, sometimes I say, I don't think you know the United States very, very well.
Right.
I don't think you
Right.
know the history. I don't think you know the present and maybe the future. Who knows what's
Hmm.
going to happen in this election in the next couple of years. So from that perspective too, that's something that scares me
Hmm.
as a Puerto Rican who is looking out for my people. Like, what would it actually look like to, belong even more fully to the
Yeah,
to be even more under the control of some of these
absolutely.
people in DC?
Hmm.
Um, what would it mean for our culture? Would being a Puerto Rican become akin to just saying like, well, I'm from Utah. It's like, all right, cool,
Yeah,
but is
yeah.
that a cultural identity? Is that
Hmm.
what's going to happen to our
Like,
our
like,
our language, our traditions?
hmm.
The way that we are as a people. There's a
Hmm.
reason why the U.S. gets called a melting pot, right? When that stuff melts, you lose a lot of it. So
Absolutely.
for political reasons, for economic reasons, for cultural reasons,
Hmm.
I and increasingly many other Puerto Ricans, because it has been a minority position for a long time. It's important to be real about that. Um, but it is changing. Independence is the right path forward.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. And free the land, man. And
Yeah.
so one thing that was interesting that stood out, you said it's not really like a Democrat Republican situation. The political divide is on this more of a status of Puerto Rico type of thing. And so as far as the political party that is for independence, um, how long would you say that's been around, and do you see more and more support growing for the Independence Party?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. There's been pro-independence parties and political movements in Puerto Rico throughout, nearly all of our history. One of the biggest moments in the independence movement back in the era when it was still against Spain was a big revolt in 1868. Um, and when the U.S. takes over in 1898, it only takes a couple years for some of the first independence parties to rise up, and then you start seeing a lot of the repression, the oppression from both the federal government, especially the FBI. There's a terrible history of FBI, suppression of the independence movement in Puerto Rico. Throughout most of the
Hmm.
20th century. The current Independence Party, which has been running in elections and is still alive and kicking and actually thriving now to
Hmm.
this day, starts in the 1940s. And for a long time it is a minority party. If you think of something like the Green Party in the
Yeah.
U.S., right, that's getting um, single digits in most elections, and a lot of that is due to in the early part of the party's history and of this sort of mid 20th century. It's right after this Commonwealth thing happens in 1952. So for a little bit of time, people think like, okay, we've settled this, we've got a new thing. This really is that special relationship, and we have some power. So it's really as the decades pass, that people start realizing that that's not the case. But there's still a lot of fear around independence, a lot of that,
Yeah.
those other dynamics. But like I said, something really changed in the last couple years. And really, I think it was three things. One is actually a Supreme Court case that got to the U.S. Supreme Court in 2016, I believe. And it's funny because it wasn't even a case about Puerto Rico status. It was like a double jeopardy criminal case.
Hmm.
But the question ended up being about like, well, is Puerto Rico really a separate jurisdiction from the U.S. for these purposes? And the justices decided, well, no, because Puerto Rico has no sovereignty.
Hmm.
So any power that it has, including its power to, convict criminals, it
Hmm.
stems from the authority of Congress.
Wow.
So that's sort of strike one in
Hmm.
2016.
Hmm.
2017, we got Hurricane Maria. You know, massive loss of life, massive loss of power and property and everything. This horrible response from the United States, and that idea of like, oh, the U.S. is there to protect us and help us starts breaking down. And then in 2019, there's a big, massive popular movement in Puerto Rico to oust a pro-statehood governor who, have been part of the terrible response to Hurricane Maria, but also got caught in a scandal with some text messaging and saying some terrible things about people, including mocking some of the people who had died during
Mm,
Hurricane Maria, which was just awful. And hundreds of thousands of people hit the streets to oust that pro-statehood governor. So those three things I think have really started changing people's minds.
mhm,
There's been some new political parties and political movements that rose up, and um, in 2016, the Independence Party, the candidate for governor for the Independence Party, got 2% of the vote.
oh
In
wow.
in 2020,
Mhm.
the Independence Party candidate for governor got 14% of the vote.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah,
Now,
yeah, yeah.
14
It
doesn't
has
sound like
grown.
a lot,
Yeah, but no,
but
that's
that's a
that's up from
that's a
two.
sevenfold.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
that's a sevenfold growth in one
Hmm.
election cycle in
Yeah,
4 years, which is incredible.
yeah.
And now the Independence Party and that particular candidate has formed an alliance with another progressive movement that's risen up on the island in the last couple of years. Um, and polls have the candidate for governor and from the Independence Party in this year's election, around 25%. Um, and because there's now about five or six political parties in Puerto Rico, in 2020 the current governor won with 33%. So there's a real opportunity and there's a
Yeah.
real possibility that a pro-independence leader for the first time ever could become governor of Puerto Rico. And I think it really speaks to this new political moment that Puerto Rico is in, where it feels like finally people are waking up to some of this stuff.
Hmm.
Um, and I'm really hopeful actually.
Yeah.
I'm feeling, especially when I think about, man, compared to American politics, I'm a little more hopeful about Puerto
Yeah,
Rican
yeah,
politics at this
yeah,
point right
yeah.
now
You gotta
about
be
the
right,
options we have.
right,
Yeah.
right.
It's a low bar. It's a low bar, but
You mentioned something about and like the FBI, and we know with the history of J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI and stateside and how they, went after everybody from Marcus Garvey and the UNIA to the Black Panther Party. Um, can you talk about some of the repression against with from the FBI against, Puerto Rican independence movements?
yeah. And you said the magic name,
Yeah,
J. Edgar
man.
Hoover, and another name or term that I bet a lot of your listeners will recognize. Anybody who has studied the history of repression of social movements in the U.S. will recognize it, which is COINTELPRO,
Absolutely.
which was the massive surveillance and suppression program from the FBI. Um, they targeted the Puerto Rican independence movement hard.
Mm,
Um, for 60 years, I think. The way that this came out is back in about 25 years ago now. Um, the full extent of this program finally came out, and from the 30s to the 90s, over 100,000 files, pages of files on pro-independence activists, not just political leaders, but teachers,
yeah.
students, anybody that just went to a meeting, right?
Right, right, right.
Anybody that, and we know that this history has been the same, against Black communities, against the American Indian movement, against so many, folks in the United States. So that's why it's really important for people too to recognize like there's things that are particular about the Puerto Rican case. But the way the United States government treats people it doesn't like
Yeah,
is
it's
often very common across communities.
right.
Um, and then there's I think I put this in my article actually. There's a letter from J. Edgar Hoover where he states it very explicitly. The goal is to dismantle um, and destroy the Puerto Rican independence movement. And they made a good try of it. They
Hmm.
weren't quite able to do it, but certainly one of the big dynamics of the status debate and of the fight over Puerto Rico status for again the entire sort of middle and even into later in the 20th century is a part of this history of suppression. Again, led by the United States, led by the FBI. with collaborators. You know, there's always
Yeah,
there's always
always,
local collaborators,
always,
right? There's
always.
always people who, you know, want to be on the side of the powerful and sign up to oppress their own, which is you know, one of the most hateful things about systems like
Hmm.
racism, like colonialism. Um, but yeah, I mean, you know, one of the most notable examples is what they did to Pedro Albizu Campos. Pedro Albizu Campos is in a way the you know the father of the modern Puerto Rican independence movement, at least against the United States. You know, he was the leader of the Nationalist Party. This is a guy who you know, he's a black Puerto Rican. He goes to Harvard. He's valedictorian of Harvard Law School, but they won't let him deliver the valedictorian speech because
Wow,
he's a
wow.
black man.
Hmm.
Um, he goes to the into the U.S. Armed Forces actually, and that's when he realizes like, damn, the United States isn't really like treating me and people who look like me, right? Because this is still the
Hmm.
segregated armed forces, you know,
Hmm.
at that time, and that's actually what radicalizes him, and he goes back to Puerto Rico and becomes the leading figure
Wow.
of the Puerto Rican independence movement. And he's eventually jailed several times during the worst part of this repression. There's pretty credible accusations that he was submitted to radiation torture in
Wow.
jail.
Hmm.
Um, so you know it's a really rough history that you know includes bombings and assassinations, and you know and includes Puerto Ricans fighting back too. There's some militant
Hmm.
movements, you know, militant nationalist movements that um, you know fought back in their own way as well. So you know we're in a different kind of stage of the struggle
Yeah.
now
Yeah.
that's more political and certainly peaceful. But yeah, I mean, if you look at just the all that's come out about the FBI files, the COINTELPRO files, especially
Hmm.
against independence activists, just the extent of the way
Hmm.
that these people were followed and infiltrated and were being surveilled, um, you know, I still have conversations with people who will say, yeah, you know, my I remember my grandmother saying like, hey, don't go to that meeting or you know don't
Hmm.
belong to that group or don't have
Yeah.
that ideology, right? Because it might get you killed
Right.
or at the very least it's going to cost you a job or something. So
Hmm.
when people talk about like, oh, why haven't Puerto Ricans supported independence, you know, if the US is so bad, it's like, well, because supporting independence for many decades was a really dangerous thing to do.
Right. And in a lot of cases, as I mean, as we can see what's going on the college campuses today, I mean, any voice of dissent is always, I mean, it takes bravery, you know, it takes courage and it takes someone to really, you know, believe in a thing. And I appreciate, you know, brothers like yourself and everybody who is shining the light on all of these different movements and fights for independence and anti-colonial movements and anti-imperialist movements, because we'll get into that in a minute, but uh, they are connected.
Yep.
And so when I on my reading list right now, I have it over here. I've had it for a while. I haven't read it yet, but I do have War Against All Puerto Ricans. I plan on
Yeah.
reading that soon. Um, but when it comes as far as like any literature on these type of things, was there anything that you read personally that kind of, you know, begin to radicalize you as far and because for me growing up, I tell everybody it was kind of when I read autobiography of Malcolm X, and you know, you it's not a thing to where you are oblivious to how these things work. It's a lot of times being able to articulate how these things work, and that obviously comes from study and knowing what's going on. Was there any moment or book or just part of what was it in your life that kind of, you know, led you to this?
Yeah, you know, I had it easy in a in
Yeah.
a way, or easier than a lot of my I know my colleagues and friends in this fight did, because a lot of times it's, you know, like, oh, my mom or my dad or whoever is like super pro statehood or super pro
Hmm.
the US, and I had to sort of discover that for myself. You know, I come from a family where at least my dad has always been a huge supporter of Puerto Rican independence, so he just gave me that as a gift growing up, I
Awesome.
feel.
Awesome.
Um, so I, you know, I always have to shout him out because that's just that was just part of my political development.
Mhm.
The other big thing I think for a lot of people in my generation, I'm 38 years old, was the fight over Vieques. So Vieques is one of the smaller island municipalities off of the coast of the main island in Puerto Rico, and for decades, Vieques was used as a live bombing, practice range by the United States. To the tune of dozens and dozens of bombs a day. To this day, they're still finding unexploded ordnance, on the beach. They use depleted uranium and things that are even illegal to
Yeah,
to
yeah.
fire. Everything you can
Hmm.
imagine about what the U.S. Navy would do with an
Right.
with an island in a colony, right? Um, and then in 1999, I believe I'm not mistaken, they messed up, and a bomb that they dropped killed a Puerto Rican who worked as a civilian guard, um, and that set off what was at the time actually, before this other movement I mentioned to oust this governor a few years ago. Um, that set off a massive movement in Puerto Rico that really cut across ideologies eventually, but that was led by the pro-independence party and
Hmm.
pro-independence leaders who had already a couple decades before gotten the U.S. Navy kicked out of
Yeah.
another small island in Puerto
Hmm.
Rico called
Hmm.
Culebra. Um, and that was a moment that I think had that kind of political impact on a lot of people in my generation. I mean, the leader of the Independence Party who did civil disobedience there, he was jailed in the federal prison in Puerto Rico for months, and I remember there was an encampment there just to kind of show support for him. And I was like 14 years old at the time. I don't think my parents let me, actually stay
Yeah.
overnight at the encampment, but I remember going a couple times. So, that was definitely a moment where even people who might not have been super, pro-independence or
Hmm.
anti the U.S. presence in Puerto Rico really, really recognized just the injustice um, of some of the ways that colonialism was manifesting. Obviously, a U.S. military plane dropping a bomb on a Puerto Rican is a pretty is a pretty direct
Right.
manifestation of that. So that was a moment for me in terms of books and things like that. It's really interesting actually because a lot of the great writers and poets and novelists in Puerto Rican history have also been leading figures in the independence movement. Um, so think about Juan Antonio Correger, who wrote a really famous poem called Boricua en la Luna, or
Mm-hmm.
Puerto Rican on the Moon, with this idea of, we're Puerto Ricans no matter where we're born, right? Even if we were
Hmm.
born on the moon, we'd be Puerto Rican.
Nice.
He was a Nationalist Party leader who was
Hmm.
jailed also,
Yeah.
Um, and so there's all these figures whose writing, even when it wasn't explicitly political or
Hmm.
pro-independence, which often it was still about that Puerto Rican identity, right?
Hmm.
About centering that and valuing that and resisting, based on that identity, because there's obviously been a huge project of attempted assimilation
Yeah.
that happened in Puerto Rico too. My dad, who was going to school in the 1950s, he went to a school where the nuns, right, these Catholic schools, were trying to teach everything in English,
Right.
and that's a big part of the history of the colonialist project as well. So yeah, more recently now, books like War Against All Puerto Ricans, and I always really appreciate too books that get into some of these more kind of hidden parts of the way
Hmm.
colonialism is manifested in more recent decades. So there's a
Hmm.
great book called Fantasy Island
Mm. Okay.
by Ed Morales, who's a professor and journalist that I really recommend.
Okay.
That really gets into some of these things of, like, you know, it's not quite a bomb dropping on
Yeah.
somebody, right?
Hmm.
Or somebody getting surveilled or shot, but these sneaky little ways that colonialism manifests in Puerto Rico. So just off the top of my head, that's another one that I'd recommend.
Absolutely. I'll definitely get that. One thing that you mentioned uh in your article that obviously this happens a lot in colonized places, but I had never heard this history. I can't remember the time period in which that you stated it happened, but you mentioned the sterilization of Puerto Rican
Mm,
women at one point. And, we think about what happened to, you know, this from the the colonialism in Central Africa to the different things that were done secretly to uh, indigenous Americans and African Americans stateside, and it's like it's more of the same, right?
Yeah.
And so can you talk about the sterilization that happened to Puerto Rican women? Because I mean, that's one of the most obviously egregious things that you can do, and which is, in my opinion, is a sign of genocide. But you know,
Yeah, no, and some people have made that argument, and the numbers are staggering. Obviously, something that's really hard to study and know for sure, but
mhm.
there's been estimates that as many as a third or a fourth of Puerto Rican women
Wow.
um may have been subjected to what in Spanish it's called la operación, right? The surgery.
Mhm.
Um
Wow.
and this is all part of this history. The US comes in the mid 20th century. They're trying to have you know get Puerto Rico a little more developed, right?
Mhm.
Not really for our own good. A lot of this too is, um, Cold War type era history too of, Russia had Cuba in the Caribbean, right? And that was sort of its showcase of the
Right.
communist project. And for a while, the United States felt like, okay, well, we got to show that capitalism works, so we'll use Puerto Rico
Mhm.
as our capitalist project. So one of the ways that happens is um, this policy called Operation Bootstrap. That's basically, we're going to industrialize Puerto Rico, but and we're going to get people out of work in the sugarcane fields, and we're going to get them into factories and stuff. But there's kind of too many Puerto Ricans for that. So actually, let's encourage a bunch of them to move away. So this is how you end up with like a million Puerto Ricans in New York, right?
Mhm.
Um, Mid 20th century, there's a massive movement to, get Puerto Ricans to immigrate to the United States. Most of them end up in New York. And there's an economic component to that too, right? Because it's hey, that's cheap new labor for
Yeah.
for
Mhm.
in the United States. At the same time that you have a lot of American companies setting up shop in Puerto Rico, where there's good cheap labor for them too. But even after that, there's still too many Puerto Ricans, and you get into all these racist and racialized discussions about population density, and it's like lack of um, family planning and stuff like that. But um, it goes to the extreme that some of the worst actors in the eugenics movement in the United States set up shop in Puerto Rico as well. Um, and yeah, this mass sterilization campaign happens, much of it without the full informed consent of women, because of the language barrier, because they targeted um, obviously the poorest, of
Mhm.
women and families in society. So a lot of the reporting that's been done about this shows that women didn't understand that this procedure was permanent, right? Because they're basically getting their tubes tied, and a lot of them thought, well, if
Mm.
they get tied, they can get untied, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Uh, and there's
yeah.
even some ways in which, the way that the sort of
They,
language for that stuff is in Spanish that contributed to that. Um, but as you said, it is shocking. It shouldn't be surprising, just given that the fact that it's happened and it's been done to so many other peoples around the world and even in the U.S. And just another of the many ways that the U.S. has just looked at what it wants Puerto
mhm.
Rican society to be and to look like, and if they don't like the way it looks like now, they'll institute some policy to try to
Yeah.
change it and make it look work a little bit more how they think it'll benefit them.
Absolutely. And you mentioned something. You mentioned this a little bit earlier in the interview, but how have corporations and billionaires used and exploited Puerto Rico, and what is La Junta?
Yeah, really important question. Um, as I said, colonialism is built for exploitation, right? And that's something that the U.S. has been doing in Puerto Rico from the very beginning. one of the first civilian governors of Puerto Rico is this guy, I think Charles Herbert Allen, I think his name is, and he gets appointed to be governor of Puerto Rico, very, very beginning of the 20th century. And he basically uses his post as governor of Puerto Rico to start, handing out land and farms to his buddies, to his corporate buddies in the United States. And he creates this sort of sugar, monopoly, sugarcane monopoly, which was the biggest, cash crop in Puerto Rico and in much of the Caribbean at the time.
Hmm.
Um, and eventually, what that conglomerate that he helped create uh, became known as Domino Sugar. Uh,
Wow.
so
Wow. Really?
that's that's the level at which this has happened
Mhm.
in Puerto Rico throughout the decades. A lot of this has happened through subsidies for corporations. And again, it's something that it sounds good in theory, right? Like,
Mhm.
oh, we need to attract all of these corporations to come
And it's going to
into.
bring jobs and all of these
Exactly,
things. Yeah.
exactly. But it's basically been a huge subsidy program for U.S. corporations. Some of that continues to this day, not to the same extent that it once did. I think because eventually they figured out that these corporations could go and get even cheaper,
Hmm.
labor in other countries and places like that, and that the U.S. was losing out on tax money. So actually, the one of the big hits that the Puerto Rican economy takes is that there was this section of the U.S. tax code called Section 936 that was, what attracted a lot of these companies to Puerto Rico.
Hmm.
And eventually the U.S. just decided, nah, we're losing out on too much tax money from, companies setting up shop in Puerto Rico, and they just sort of took it away.
Wow.
And that transformed the Puerto Rican economy um, overnight and in a way that Puerto Rico still hasn't totally recovered from. So that happens a couple of decades ago, and then 10, 15 years ago, depending on when you when you think it started, you get the hit of the Great Recession, right?
Hmm.
And that really sets off, a massive economic crisis, which turns into a debt crisis
Hmm.
in Puerto Rico. Um, so around 2015, 2016, Puerto Rico's got like $70 billion in debt, and the governor just announces, okay, this debt is unpayable.
Yeah.
Um, and so Puerto Rico starts going like, well, let's declare bankruptcy.
Hmm.
But US law doesn't allow Puerto Rico to declare bankruptcy.
Mm. Right.
So
Wow. So
we
is
used
there?
to have that ability, and Congress just took it away.
Wow. Wow.
So now we have this problem, right? Puerto Rico doesn't have the legal ability to declare bankruptcy. So Congress has to get involved again, and they say, okay, we're going to pass a law. We're going to let you declare a form of bankruptcy, but we're going to put a fiscal control board, which Puerto Ricans have nicknamed La Junta,
Hmm.
in charge of Puerto Rico to oversee the debt restructuring process and to kind of, help Puerto Rico get its act together economically. But again, there's so many things that just mirror things that have happened in other places in the U.S. If you think about the fiscal boards instituted in places like Detroit,
Hmm.
which some people have blamed their decisions for the water crisis in Flint and all of the austerity that
Absolutely.
led to that
Hmm.
decaying infrastructure. So this is basically what starts happening in Puerto Rico and what's still happening now because the board is still in place. The board
Hmm.
is seven unelected leaders that are appointed by Congress and the president,
Hmm.
and they have basically absolute power now
Wow.
over Puerto Rico. They can set the budget, they can
Hmm.
veto Puerto Rican laws. They operate in near total secrecy. They're not even subject to public records
Hmm.
laws in Puerto Rico. And they've been implementing basically a massive austerity program, slashing money for schools, for hospitals, slashing pensions. Just today or yesterday, there's a story that they're trying to cut another $100 million off of the budget of the University of Puerto Rico, which is the
Wow.
biggest engine of, knowledge
It's
creation and economic
yeah.
growth.
Then
It's
they and
public
they do
education.
and they do the same thing to HBCUs here in stateside. There's apparently owed $440 million by the state that they'll probably never get, and it's like these these people they want to attack our it's they want to attack our any ability that we have to create and provide for ourselves and to always be dependent on this
Yep.
system. And it's terrible, man. And so you said University of Puerto Rico, you said that was the biggest, well, that is the biggest university in Puerto Rico.
Yeah, the University of Puerto Rico, which has, multiple campuses throughout the island. It's the biggest university. It's a public university,
Hmm.
so obviously it's the most affordable. It's also the best and the most,
Hmm.
prestigious university in Puerto Rico. So Puerto Rico, unlike, in a lot of places in the States where, you might have a Harvard or a, whatever, a
Yeah.
private university that is considered, at least, and it isn't always, but better than the state school, right? In Puerto Rico, the state school is the best school also.
Nice.
It's
Hmm.
also, his by the way, historically, which also has some it goes into why it's always been attacked by certain politicians and now people like the board. The University of Puerto Rico, like as you said, like what's happening now in campus across the United States, has always been the focal
Hmm.
point of activism, of
Hmm.
resistance, of and of pro-independence activism specifically, to the point where there was an event in the 30s called the Massacre of Rio Piedras, which is where the main campus of the University of Puerto Rico is, where pro-independence activists were shot.
Wow.
And that's something that's happened, that kind of repression throughout the decades. And right now, I'm proud to say that there is a pro-Palestine encampment going on at the University of Puerto Rico. They just started it last
Wow.
week. So,
Wow.
the University of Puerto Rico is a huge, huge heart, cultural, political beating
Hmm.
heart of Puerto Rican society. And if you're trying to stamp
Hmm.
out the beating heart of our people in a way, that's one of the places that they've gone after.
Man, that's but what the University of Puerto Rico represents obviously is amazing. I love to hear that as far as just their acts of solidarity with other oppressed and the genocide that's going on. And it's no obviously you know this, but it's no coincidence that a school where people go get educated and some become radicalized would
Yes.
be one of the main targets. But as we see, like the Panthers and Merritt College, and college campuses are hotbeds in a lot of historically for organizing and activism. And um, obviously cutting funding is probably one way they're trying to attack that. You said something earlier that I wanted you to touch on again, if you don't mind, because I think it's a wonderful sentiment that people need to understand. Puerto Rico has a wonderful culture. Um, you have, the history of, Taino being there for years. You have uh, the, importation of Africans during the, slave trade who had, you know, things that they brought, culture that they brought from Africa. And you have these beautiful expressions of Puerto Rican culture that you say if statehood was embraced could be lost, right? And if you can just speak a little bit more about that, because I think that's very important. Because here, we have there are movements that are popping up that I see online often that are disguise themselves as revolutionary movements, but they are truly
Mhm.
assimilationist at heart. And the idea of you know we're striving to hold on to as much of our own culture as we can, and any ideas of assimilating seems to be going in the wrong direction. But can you speak about just like the beauty of Puerto Rican culture and why it needs to be preserved, and how you know statehood could jeopardize that?
Yeah, and Puerto Rican culture is beautiful, as you said. It's complicated, right? And it's a mixture of all these different things, including, by the way, of American culture now. You
Mm,
can't be,
hmm.
you know, owned by, I never say part of the US because technically Puerto Rico isn't part of the US. It's owned
Hmm.
by the US.
Hmm.
And that's not me saying that. That's the words of the US Supreme Court. But either way, um, you can't be in this relationship, even a messed up one, for
Yeah,
125 years and
facts.
not absorb
Hmm.
parts of that culture as well. So it's all in there, but it's all in there, and it has created this unique expression of Puerto Ricanness that I think most people would identify as different and distinct from an American culture, even though, it's
Hmm.
fair to recognize too that American culture can be a lot of different things for different
Absolutely.
people.
Hmm.
But I always turn to the issue of language because
Hmm.
partially because I think the language unlocks so much of the other culture, whether you're thinking about literature or music or traditions or even just
Hmm.
being able to understand your grandma's stories,
Yeah.
or your grandpa's recipes.
Mhm. Right,
Um,
right, right.
so to me, language is such a big part of it. As I said, there were attempts for decades to turn Puerto Rico into an English-speaking territory, and we have just resisted that with force to the point that I think 85 to 90% of Puerto Ricans not just don't, not just speak Spanish at home, because I think 99% of Puerto Ricans speak Spanish at home, but don't even consider themselves, proficient English speakers.
Hmm.
So, what would happen if Puerto Rico became a state? There are some people who think that Puerto Rico could just keep operating as a state, with Spanish being the language of government and education and public life. I think if you look at the history of the US, that's a pipe dream because there's
Right.
actually a lot of states in the US that used to be Spanish speaking territories.
Hmm.
I live in one of them. I'm in Colorado.
Wow. Right, right.
Colorado means red. My wife
Wow.
is my wife is from New Mexico.
Right,
You know,
right.
Arizona, California, Florida. We
And we
actually have a lot of examples of places, and this is not even to mention Hawaii, which is, a
That's what I
whole,
was about to say. Hawaii,
yeah,
they've been, I think I read something that they it was like they at one point it was illegal to even teach some of their indigenous languages in schools in Hawaii, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, language and culture go hand in hand, and uh,
yeah, yeah. And I mean, Hawaii, I think to this day they are struggling to try, fighting tooth and nail to try to get the Hawaiian language back because of
mhm,
all of this assimilation and that entire history. But again, you don't even have to go that far. Just look at the entire southwestern United States. Um, so I don't think it's feasible for Puerto Rico to keep being a Spanish speaking place
yeah,
as a state. Um, and I don't even think we would want it to because what it would do is basically create a sort of separate and unequal situation
hmm,
where, what would it mean for you as my fellow American, right? If Puerto Rico became a state, to not even be able to understand what's going on in Puerto Rico,
right,
or for me not to be able to understand you. So I think as a state, Puerto Rico will be forced with this choice of either we assimilate and we got to say screw it, we got to do everything in English because that's the language of everything in the United States. That's what's going to unlock political opportunity, economic opportunity, um, or we're going to try to hang on to Spanish and we're going to be in the situation where we can't even talk to and understand
yeah,
the rest of the people in our country, that we're now a part of, including the politicians who are,
hmm,
making decisions for us. Um, so, I think that's really just a concrete example of the kinds of horrible choices that statehood would
yeah,
force on
yeah,
Puerto Rico. And again, you lose language, you lose so much else,
yeah, yeah,
because I don't know who's going to be reading the same stuff that I was reading when I was a kid,
hmm,
right? These great, poets and novelists and pro-independence folks. If Puerto Rico becomes a state and my grandchildren lose their Spanish language, which, by the way, is what already happens with a lot of immigrants in the U.S., Latino immigrants specifically. You get to that third generation, and there's very good research on this from Pew Research and other places. You stop identifying as, your
Mhm.
country of origin or even
Right.
as a Latino, right?
Hmm.
You lose the language, you lose so many parts of that cultural identity. So to those of us who really treasure that beautiful Puerto Ricanness, as you said, that's one of the great fears of statehood. And we shouldn't be in that position, right? Again, we
Yeah.
got invaded by somebody else. Like,
Right.
why would, even if you accepted the argument that statehood would help economically, which I don't think is necessarily
Why are
true,
we in this position in the
why are we
first
in the
place?
position to have to choose between, our pocketbook and our culture?
Right, right. Yeah, that's terrible. That's terrible. You mentioned a few of them, but if you can mention them again and maybe some other ones that we need to know about. But who are some of the, revolutionaries? Because the audience of this show they are big readers, and so who are some of the revolutionaries, historically in Puerto Rico that have, whether they were writers or poets or boots on the ground, just people that we should know about.
Yeah, yeah, I could mention a couple of them. Again, going back to even before the U.S., the one of the first great revolts against, empire in Puerto Rico in 1868 is the Grito de Lares, or the scream, the shout of Lares, which is a town in the sort of central Midwestern area in Puerto Rico. And that was led by Ramon Emeterio Betances, who wasn't just a pro-independence activist, but was also a really respected abolitionist, someone who was working, with the Dominican Republic and
Mm,
other countries, and actually had this dream of sort of integration of the Caribbean, right, and
mhm.
creating this confederation of nations, in the Caribbean. So Betances is definitely a name to know. Pedro Albizu Campos, the guy I mentioned,
Hmm.
leader of the Nationalist Party, another, Afro-Puerto Rican man, which, is another
Yeah,
another connection that's important to highlight
absolutely.
too. Um, the ways that, some of these folks experienced oppression and understood those connections. But Albizu Campos, leader of the Nationalist Party in the mid early to mid part of the 20th century in Puerto Rico. Um, and then you have folks like Juan Antonio Correger, the poet who I mentioned.
Hmm.
Um, a lot of actually going back to to even some of the pre-US stuff. One of the great Puerto Rican poets, Lola Rodriguez de Tio, she actually wrote the original words um, to the Puerto Rican national
Hmm.
anthem. It was a
Mm,
revolutionary anthem.
wow.
Um, Eventually, some modern politicians changed the words,
Hmm.
and they
Right.
turned the
Of
national
course.
anthem into some BS about how Columbus landed
Oh
and thought
no,
that the
man.
island was so like pretty.
No,
Um,
man.
but the original, anthem,
Mhm.
um, it starts, in Spanish, obviously, but it starts, wake up Puerto Ricans, they've given the signal. And it's
Mm.
about grabbing our machetes,
Yeah, 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 yeah. No,
um,
that's what I'm talking about.
the stuff the national anthem should
Yeah,
be, right?
yeah.
Other great poets like Julia de Burgos,
Mhm.
actually working with somebody now here in Colorado who's putting together a play about Julia de Burgos, is one of the great Puerto Rican poets,
Mhm.
but also was a leader of the nationalist movement here in Puerto Rico, and the Daughters of the Revolution. That they were called the sort of female wing of the Nationalist Party. Um, so yeah, I mean, and even into modern times, a lot of the great Puerto Rican writers are also people who sympathize with Puerto Rican independence, because I think the sensibility that you need to have, and not just writers, by the way,
Mhm.
artists too, the sensibility that you need to have as an artist, the pride and the in your identity and in who you are and how you're trying to express that.
Mhm.
Um, I think has always been real. There's always been a really strong connection between art and literature
Oh,
and that
absolutely.
political struggle in Puerto Rico. And again, I know it's something that's also the case with many other
Mhm.
peoples and struggles in the U.S. and around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was looking for a name. I couldn't find it, but I know in this book here in the Diary of Malcolm X, 1964, it talks about whenever he went on his Africa tour, and I forgot what country he was in, but uh, he met a Puerto Rican organizer there, and they were, supposed to link up whenever he got back, and do some work. I was looking for a name. Um, I was looking for a name, but I'm pretty sure she was, you know, someone who was a proponent of independence from just from how he talked about her. And
Yeah.
so that kind of leads to the next question is, uh, when we see what's going on in the world now, well, actually, before we even go there, 1898 Spanish American War, and as you stated, Puerto Rico was one of the spoils of war for the United States. Also, Guam. Does Guam have any similar independence movements?
Yeah, yeah, actually I follow I think I follow them on Instagram.
Nice,
I
nice.
think they call it Independent Guahan or something, which
Mhm,
might be the indigenous
mhm.
original name of Guam in their in language. You know, all of the US territories or colonies I think have similar movements. You know, they're all obviously very specific to their own
Mhm.
context. And while I certainly support the right to freedom and self-determination for all, you know, colonized peoples, which includes
Absolutely.
the peoples of these territories, you know, they've got their fights to fight and their stories to tell about what they want their political futures to be. But yeah, there's definitely independence movement, just like there still is, by the way, in a place like Hawaii,
Yeah.
where, you know, you still have folks saying like, no, no, we're still the Kingdom of Hawaii.
Right.
We're still a nation that was occupied by the U.S. and that's ongoing, but there's still an independent nation here. Um, so yeah, you know, there's parallels. You know, that every situation is different, and obviously Puerto Rico is by far the largest of the U.S.
Mhm,
colonies. Um, but similar struggles with in, you know, in places like American Samoa, like Guam,
mhm.
and I think when the U.S. finally decides that it needs to, you know, do something about these undemocratic political systems, it's going to have to do something about all of them because when hopefully Puerto Rico or any of us attains independence first, I think you're going to see some of the others go like, well, hold on, you can't
Yeah.
do that for one and then leave the rest of us in this colonized state.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I wanted to kind of end it here, like with, obviously with what's going on in Palestine, what's going on in the Congo, the Puerto Rican independence movement, as you mentioned, the Hawaiian independence movement, what's going on stateside, as far as, the oppression of indigenous Americans. And as, Huey talked about, in his internal colonialism ideas that you know hey, we are colonial subjects here stateside as well. And so
Yeah.
when we think about um all of these things and the connectedness of imperialism, colonialism, white hegemony, how important is it for us to show and have solidarity with the movements of the oppressed all over the world?
It's incredibly important. And you know, actually, I help lead an organization called Boricuas Unidos en la Diáspora, or, you know, Puerto Ricans United in the Diaspora.
Mhm.
Um, we are having an event just this week in St. Louis about the shared anti-colonial struggles of Puerto Rico and Palestine.
Wow.
And like I said, you've got students in Puerto Rico right now, you know, camping out in their own university lawn for Palestine. And there's been, you know, marches all of the past, you know, 6 months. And by the way, it's not just one-sided. There's a great image that somebody shared with me of a Palestinian magazine back in the 70s or 80s that printed a poem from a New Rican poet,
Wow.
you know, about the
Mhm.
condition of Puerto Rico
Mhm.
and that oppression. So that
Wow.
solidarity
Mhm.
is always been there. And you know, um, what's been really heartening to me seeing all of the movement for for the liberation of Palestine over the past couple of months. Even though obviously it's a heartbreaking and tragic situation, it's been such a great reminder that there are people that are ready to rise up
Hmm.
and fight for people and fight for what's right. And unfortunately, that's been missing a lot in the case of Puerto Rico. Um, you know, I can understand why, especially because like you have seen, Puerto Ricans who want statehood or who are okay with the status quo. So it doesn't seem like that's there hasn't sort of been that call from Puerto Rico that maybe people in the US and in other places can respond to. But as I say in that article that you've been referencing, people need to understand that not as an acceptance of colonialism or of oppression, but as a symptom of it,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
As being so beat down that a lot of people can't even see their way to imagining a future
Right.
of liberation. Um, but we need that solidarity. We need that solidarity from everybody. And you don't have to. I think me and you are probably a little more radical than the average
Right.
American.
Right.
Um, but you don't need to be a radical or a leftist or whatever you want to call yourself to just believe and fight for the right thing. And
Yeah.
one of the other
Right.
pieces I always talk about is um, the United States itself has already acknowledged that Puerto Rico was a colony. Like its Congress has acknowledged it, the Supreme Court has acknowledged it. So they're not even fighting at this point that
Right. Right. It's just
that
out in the
there's this
open.
incredibly unjust thing happening. So
Hmm.
now it just becomes a matter of what are we going to do about it?
What?
It's statehood or independence, right?
Right.
They've had 126 years to give us statehood, and they haven't done it, and they're
Right.
not going to do it. And we could have a whole other
Yeah.
hour-long conversation about the politics and of what makes it impossible. And how many Republicans do you think are going to vote for adding a state of 3 million brown people
Right.
who they're all convinced are going to be Democratic voters to the U.S.,
Well,
right?
well, that's what I kind of wanted to ask you too before we go. I'm
Yeah,
glad you
yeah.
mentioned that. Um, with this new election cycle coming, and obviously Biden and Trump, um, is what we're looking at.
You have
But
to pause there just to like
yeah,
come to terms with that,
yeah,
right?
man, because damn.
Yeah.
But like, do they ever even address the issue of Puerto Rican sovereignty? Like, does it ever? I mean, do they even like if is because we know politicians lie, but do they even care enough to lie and say, hey, we're looking into this?
The Democrats care enough to lie,
Hmm. Yeah.
or
Okay.
they
Yeah.
or
Yeah. I
they know
believe.
that they know that they should,
Hmm.
say something, and they have outright lied about this to the point where, President Biden, he's said like, I believe in statehood for Puerto Rico. I want it to happen, and then after the election, he didn't do anything about it.
Yeah.
Um, Senator, Chuck Schumer, majority leader in the Senate, I'm excited to make Puerto Rico a state. They say this stuff usually before elections, and then once the election rolls around, oh, I'm not going to support like statehood for Puerto Rico or
Yeah.
anything like that. And we've just seen this for decades and decades and decades, from both parties a little bit, but the Republicans now have gotten to the point where they are openly speaking out against Puerto Rican statehood. Mitch McConnell has called it like full bore socialism.
Wow.
Lindsey Graham is on the stump against
Hmm.
talking about against statehood. Trump on the campaign trail now in the primaries actually cut an ad in the Iowa primaries against DeSantis, accusing him of supporting Puerto Rican statehood. Because DeSantis back in the day voted for a bill that might have eventually kind of maybe led to statehood. So this has become like a talking point in the Republican Party. Because again, they see this as like some ploy to get more, brown Democratic voters
Yeah.
into the US.
Right.
And that's what's never going to happen, right? I mean, it's just never, it's not even going to sniff
Right.
anywhere near 60 votes in the Senate, and which is what it would take. Um, and then the Democrats, you have some of the more progressive Democrats that are a little more open to the ideas of self-determination and independence, but there's been some hesitation to kind of say it out loud. I think there's this, really wrong idea that um, it would somehow be like abandoning
Hmm.
Puerto Ricans, right? If you say, the US wants to let Puerto Rico go. But no, of course it's not abandoning us. It's just, again, it's liberating a people. What could
Yeah.
be
Right, right,
more
right.
just or moral than
They
that?
can't handle freedom. They can't,
Yeah, yeah,
that's this idea that they give colonized people is like, because they say that, I read them. I can't remember who it was recently say that about, it might have been France, because you know what's going on in formerly French West Africa,
yeah,
like this whole paternal type of, you know what I mean? Like the oppressed can't handle freedom, right? So we have to be the ones to spoon feed them, it's such a terrible notion, but it's used all across the board as we see.
yeah.
Um, but
And
yeah.
it's definitely, that's really the foundation of going back to the beginning, it's the foundation of this unjust colonial relationship, and that's how they legally justified it. These Supreme Court cases that say these are savage peoples, so
Mm,
they don't need self-government, they can't
that's what
really
this
have it.
what the Supreme Court said that.
Yeah, yeah. So, because again, and we got to wrap up soon, but
Yeah, I know, I
there's
know,
so
I
much
know. Yeah, I know.
there's
It's
so
so
much
yeah,
history.
right,
There's
right,
so
right.
much history about Puerto Rico. But just real quick, the U.S. invades Puerto Rico and basically is holding it as again as a piece of land, as a territory. So all these questions start coming up of like, all right, well, it's an American territory now. Do we need to like give these people some rights? Is the Constitution going to apply? Um, so you get these rulings in the early 20th century that are now known as the insular cases, right? Because they were dealing with these islands. And the Supreme Court basically decides, these are alien races and savage peoples. And I'm putting
Mm.
it in quotes because you can look it up. Downs versus Bidwell. People can
Wow,
Google it. That's literally, what the
that's the playbook. Yep.
that's the language that the Supreme Court used. And those cases are still good law to this day. Those cases have
Wow.
never been overturned.
Mhm.
So, in the eyes of the Supreme Court, me and my fellow Puerto Ricans are just still savage peoples that,
Wow.
and
Wow.
but that's what you're saying. That's what they use to justify, this idea that we can't, we don't even know, we wouldn't even know how to rule ourselves. So somebody else better do it for us. And I don't think any Democrat would put it or Republican will put it. Well, some Republicans might put it in those
Yeah, yeah,
terms.
yeah, yeah.
Um, Democrats usually find some nicer ways to
Right.
put it. But I still think in the back of their mind, there's still some of the
Oh
same
yeah,
ideas
absolutely.
of like, well, look, this thing we got going on with Puerto Rico might not be perfect,
Hmm.
but it's definitely got to be better than like just letting them fend for themselves,
Right,
right?
right, right, right.
And that's, it's such an insidious idea that's, as I said, 126 years and counting of US rule over Puerto Rico.
Yeah, man. Well, I, first off, again, thank you for, coming through and shedding light on this situation. There's so much to talk about. We're probably gonna have to do this again
Yeah,
sometime.
please.
But again, for anybody that is interested in learning more and wanting to, just see your thoughts on these things, how can they follow you on social media and where your works are and all of these things?
Yeah, definitely. So, I'm at Alberto Medina PR on X or Twitter, whatever people are calling it these days. Also encourage people to check out, our organization, budpr.org, budpr.org. We're really trying to build a network of not just Puerto Ricans, but also allies, talking about that solidarity of people who, are ready to contribute to this political struggle for sovereignty. And yeah, always trying to write about Puerto Rico. So got some articles in current affairs and some other publications. So read me, read other people, read some pro-statehood people too. See if you happen to
Mhm.
to agree with them.
Right,
I
right,
always say like,
right.
I'd rather people be interested enough to read every perspective,
Hmm.
and then we can have a conversation about it, and
Absolutely.
and I can argue with you, and hopefully I'll win that argument. But what I hate is people thinking like, ah, that's not my issue,
Yeah,
it's not for me to deal with. So I really appreciate you having me on. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk about Puerto Rico. And it's one of the ways we express solidarity too, right? Just listening to each
absolutely.
other and learning about each other's struggles. So thank you so much for the opportunity. And yeah, let's do it again sometime.
Absolutely, man. You have a great night.
All right, thanks, Raheem.
All right, peace.